Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of our TechLaw video series, where today we'll be talking about robots in 2025. I'm Michael Stead. I'm a senior associate in the intellectual property and technology team. I'm joined by my fantastic colleague, Kurt Davies. Kurt, you're going to kick us off by telling us a little bit about what exactly we mean by humanoid robots.
Yeah, so thanks, Michael. First of all, good to be here. Bit of a brief explainer before we launch in to humanoids, and just looking very briefly at the evolution of robots. So this episode is titled Rise of the Robots. And robots, some listeners might be thinking that covers all manner of sins, robots. So if we start decades ago with the old school robots, if you like, these are the robots that we've all seen on TV, on adverts, etc., often in large manufacturing plants. They're big, powerful robots used in industrial applications. So they typically require a lot of capital expenditure. They don't really work alongside humans. In fact, they're often so dangerous they're segregated in their own safety cell to prevent accidents and interaction with humans. And crucially, they can only really operate in very specific environments, and that's because they're pre-programmed with software code. So they often need a certain temperature, certain measurements, certain utility input in order to function as intended.
And this is where we kind of think about kind of the evolution of robots. This is where we get on to kind of cobots. Is that right?
That's exactly right, yeah. So we've kind of moved on, not entirely, but one of the most mass-produced type of robot at the minute is the cobot, also known as a cooperative robot. And as the name suggests, this is a robot that works alongside humans. So they're often cheaper than those big robots I just mentioned, and they're definitely more mobile, although they are still limited to an extent by their environment. So, for example, rather than operating in an enclosed safety cell, they might operate on a fairly open section of factory floor alongside humans. And because they operate alongside humans, they'll often have many safety features. So, for example, they may use torque sensors to detect and react to contact with humans and various trip hazards. And you'll often find them in logistics warehouses for picking, sorting, and packing alongside humans, with humans intervening where necessary. But we're now at the third stage of this broad evolutionary chain, if you like, of humanoid robots. So, Michael, what exactly do we mean by a humanoid robot, and why do we call it a humanoid robot?
Yeah, so these are, the kind of the classic sci-fi iRobot style robots that kind of look humanoid. So, they've got arms, legs, and kind of something that resembles a head, eyes, and that sort of thing. You can kind of describe them as like the physical embodiment of AI. Like if you're thinking about artificial intelligence, what it means, if you're going to try to draw a picture of it, you'd probably think of like these kind of humanoid, intelligent-like robot-type humanoids. And I read and watch a lot of sci-fi, which probably won't surprise you too much. But usually these kind of humanoid robots, they aren't considered good. They're not often the goodies. And I've had discussions with people and friends, and they've said, why do they have to make them humanoid? Like, why do we have to kind of anthropomorphize these things? Because if you do that, humans in general, we have a habit of anything that looks vaguely human or has human features, we place our own human heuristics onto it. So if it's happy, we're happy, and if it asks for things nicely, we tend to be polite to things. But these are meant to be tools, and so I think that's where the slight fear comes from. But there is actually a good reason, apart from scary sci-fi, that they are designed to look human-like. It's because we make our world suitable for us as humans that are, between 5'5" and 6 foot tall, or 6'5" in your case. All the things that we interact with are between these limbs. So if we're looking at safety notices, it's going to be about eye height. Warehouses are designed for boxes picked up at around our height and put down. So it's useful to have robots that are made like us, so they can interact like us in the human world. And that's kind of this main distinction between the humanoid robots and the cobots that you were talking about, because cobots are made for a very specific task in a specific robot environment. It might have humans there as well, but they have to have lots of safety. This next step of the kind of humanoid robots, they're designed to be able to move into any place that has traditionally been done by humans. So then the natural evolution of that is that then those humans could also be replaced, and those jobs could be done by the humanoid robots as well. So that's kind of the concept of humanoid robots. Do you want to go a little bit into where we are in terms of technology and where big companies are in terms of the developing of these humanoid robots?
Yeah, I guess firstly, thanks for the 6'5" call out. I'm actually 6'4", but I always welcome a bit of height inflation. Yeah, it makes sense to talk about where we are currently with humanoid robots before we talk about what the next 18 to 24 months might look like. So it won't surprise you to hear that the two main players in the humanoid robot race are the US and China. So in the US, we've got companies like Boston Dynamics, we've got Tesla, which everyone will have heard of, and we've got Figure AI. And then over in China, we've got Unitree and also BYD, the EV manufacturer, which is really tearing up that market at the moment. So what can these humanoids do at the moment? Well, if we do a quick Google of Boston Dynamics Atlas robot, you can see videos of it moving engine covers between supplier containers and a mobile sequencing dolly. You can also see it reacting to its environment, so it can avoid trip hazards. It can change its movements without pre-programming to avoid or interact appropriately with other humans. If you carry on searching a bit more, you can also find much cooler videos of it doing parkour and some pretty cool synchronized backflips. And in a similar vein, the Tesla Optimus robot also has plenty of footage of it doing various similar things. So you can see it walking on uneven terrain, you can see it catching a tennis ball, you can see it serving drinks and dancing. You can also catch it doing a couple of household chores. It can even handle eggs. You may be thinking, okay, that all sounds pretty cool, but actually what's the point of all that? It might be nice to have a robot that does backflips, but how is this going to increase my productivity? That's the angle that Figure AI are currently coming at it from. So Figure AI has had investment from Microsoft, from Nvidia and Amazon. And its latest Figure 02 robot has human-like precision and is currently being tested in a real-world environment. So you can find many of these robots in a large automotive player's manufacturing plant, and they're being tested with actual tasks. They're working alongside actual humans, and any failures or maintenance is being carried out in a real world environment. So that robot at the moment is less about the fancy backflips and is more about actually how can this increase industrial productivity.
I tell you what I love actually about the Figure AI robots as well is that they said in a recent press release for their Bot Q facility that they're going to get their Figure robots to build more of them. So I love the idea that it's kind of like perpetually self-replicating machine to just like, you can tell my mind goes straight to sci-fi with these sorts of things, but I did quite like that.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to do much for those who might be listening to this that are worried about the iRobot situation. So we'll gloss over that one. And then over in China, speaking of things going viral and cool videos, a lot of people have no doubt seen the news that the Beijing half marathon featured no less than 21 humanoid robots. So this is the first time that humanoid robots have been involved in a half marathon, as far as we know at least. The winner was Tiangong Ultra, which won in a time of 2 hours, 40 minutes and 42 seconds. So Michael, it would nearly beat us, I think. Only 6 of the robots finished the race, and one even knocked over a human. So we're clearly not quite there yet. But again, interesting and exciting stuff nonetheless. China as well has also made some strides in, for lack of a better term, robo-dogs, so robotic dogs. And these are often used in a military context. So again, you can find videos of robot dogs with weapons strapped to their back or investigating hostile terrain. But that's generally where we are at the moment. We've got Goldman Sachs predicting that I think it's 2035. By 2035, the market will be worth about 38 billion annually, the humanoid robot market. But Michael, how do you think we'll get there, and what kind of advancements do you think we'll see in the near-term future that will get us to that number?
Yeah, so I think big trends, and you could have guessed that I'll mention AI in any segment that I'm talking about. But yeah, AI is going to be a big boost. The rapid progression that we're seeing from both sides of the pond in terms of AI system development is going to make robots much more sophisticated. So we're just talking about Figure AI, for example. They, for their Figure robots, they were using OpenAI with collaboration with OpenAI for the LLMs that did the kind of the intelligent thinking and reasoning and that sort of thing. But earlier this year, they've ended that collaboration, basically saying that, look, actually, LLMs, those large language models, they're getting pretty commoditized, and there are so many fantastic open source options now, they didn't actually feel the need for that collaboration anymore, which is really quite interesting. And there are other kind of common platforms that are being developed that are really good for this as well. So one of the problems with AI training in physical environments is how you kind of scale it up quickly. So before OpenAI were the behemoth they were now, the kind of experiments they were doing were on things like computer games and how to make AI systems play computer games as well as human players. And so one of my favorite games, Dota 2, they developed a bot for, and they were able to train these bots to play virtually for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of hours simultaneously. That's how they got all that training data together. It's really hard to do that with robots in a physical world because, as we've been talking about, we don't have millions of robots now we can collect all this training data from. So NVIDIA have been working on this, and they've developed Cosmos, which is this collection of WFMs, so more acronyms for you. These are world foundation models. So it's basically digital twin type replication, like really accurate replications of like warehouses and other physical environments with accurate physics representation, so that you can, in theory, train physical robots in a virtual world that will then, so when they know what it feels like to drop a cup or drop a plate or something like that, this virtual world they've been trained on really closely matches the physical world. And so that's really interesting developments there. Open source is actually quite a big area too for robotics and robotics development. So there is an open source framework called ROS, so the robot operating system, latest version being ROS 2, and this is it's kind of like a middleware platform. So it works between kind of the robotic that you're developing, getting instructions on what it's actually doing, and it's that kind of middleware software that does all the things. And the latest version of it's interesting as well because it can handle real-time computing signals and communications. So, and without getting too much into the weeds of the detail, it's interesting because typically speaking, anything robotic or safety related needs to be based on real-time computing. That is to say, when one communication is sent to another part of a robot or an arm or something else, it needs to have good confidence that that's going to happen effectively immediately, or at least a certainty as to when it's going to happen. So other systems, they tend to work with kind of shared resources. So the best analogy for this, I think, is that if you're driving in your car and you're trying to find a new podcast to play on Spotify or what have you, you don't want that computer to be sharing the resources of processing with the same system that's detecting if you're about to hit a lamppost. You want the system that's interacting with the lamppost to be detecting it and putting everything in place first. So the new developments in the open source technology are really developing and putting into place these essential things to allow mass adoption from large companies, and that's happening, and we're seeing lots of adoption of these open source technologies as well. What about the hardware side, Kurt? What are we seeing there in terms of the trends and the trends over the coming months?
Yeah, that was fascinating, and I think that on hardware, it's sometimes been, in the last few years at least, been seen as the poor relation of the hardware and software combo. Generally seen as lagging behind software in the last few years, particularly with the advances in AI and open source that you just mentioned. But this could be, well, it is changing, and it could change even more in the next 12 to 18 months, I think. So particularly when we talk about humanoids in the area of battery advances. So the EV race has meant that battery technology has gone from strength to strength in the past 2 to 3 years, and it's going to continue to do that if the world is serious about adopting EV properly. And of course, we have large EV players such as Tesla and BYD in the humanoid race, so we can expect these learnings to be applied to robots. And so what might that mean practically? Well, at the minute, we've got lithium-ion batteries, which are currently usually the battery of choice in humanoids, but this could change from, for example, solid-state batteries are coming as emerging as a viable alternatives, along with innovations in battery management systems and also in thermal management. Without going too deep into that, what does that all mean? Well, essentially, it means if you're a consumer or if you're in industry, it means shorter charging times, a longer battery life, and more charge cycles. There's even been talk of solar-powered humanoids, but we're not quite there yet. And all of those advances make adoption of these things even easier, both from a consumer and from an industry point of view. So battery advances is definitely one. We'll go over to semiconductor chips very briefly, because it's nothing new that the semiconductor technology has been rapidly advancing. It's been doing that for decades thanks to Moore's law, but again, we can expect that to continue, Michael. And as you've just mentioned, NVIDIA have recently really thrown some weight behind humanoids and declared, I think it was at the start of this year, declared that they are now in the age of the generalist robot, and announcing various packages and technologies to help with humanoid development. So again, watch that space. And then away from chips, I just think more modular designs perhaps of humanoids. So for example, you can add and take things away from a robot to make it more or less suited to a particular task, rather than having one universal thing that has to do everything. That will help with cost, and it will also help with maintenance if you need to send a particular part away. Again, that is more user-friendly. And then finally, just in sensor technology and deployment, I mentioned before that Tesla's Optimus can pick up an egg. That might seem like a fairly easy feat for a human being, but actually for a robot, that's been a problem that's been a difficult one to crack. Pun definitely intended, but it's been the development in hardware and software that has allowed it to do that. And we'll expect to see that kind of dexterity and that senseness of touch really improve as well over the short term. So we've got great advances in software, we've got great advances in hardware, all very exciting, but is anyone actually producing these things in any kind of serious way at the moment? And if they are, is anyone buying them?
Yeah, so I think you're right to phrase the question that way, because as we've seen with lots of technologies, the hype definitely comes before you actually see lots of the results, which is, the way it's always been in technology. But yeah, there are bona fide efforts in production and sale at the moment, not perhaps as much as someone make you think, but certainly so. In China, you've got Unitary Robotics, Azibot, Engine AI. They're all companies that are announcing mass productions of units within the thousands this year at least. Back over in America, Tesla have recently said that they're expecting a limited production run of their humanoid robot Optimus. Probably several thousand this year they've predicted, with a pretty ambitious target of up to 100,000 next year. I think what Tesla's ambition here is to kind of create these robots that kind of replace these dull and dangerous jobs from humans. And like I said a little bit before about the reason why robots are created in a humanoid form is to be able to replace jobs that might be dangerous or particularly dull, or not be particularly that are unsafe for us to operate in. But then that often leads me to think, well, if we were then to be able to replace those jobs with humans, then there wouldn't be any need for those environments to be kind of human friendly. So it's interesting to think about how things might transform in the future if we didn't need humans to operate in all these places. So you do see things like dark warehouses where they're designed to operate effectively entirely autonomously. Things that we take for granted you wouldn't actually need. You'd be able to utilize more space and that sort of thing. But yeah, so back to on production. Yeah, so Agility Robotics as well. Their Digits robot, they've got a RoboFab, an assembly facility that can produce up to 10,000 units a year for its Digit robots. But I think we're also likely to see alternative deployment models. So at the moment, you could think of it as it's a pretty stark way to look at it, and so I apologize for that. But if you're looking from a purely kind of balance sheet perspective, you could say, right, well, if this particular humanoid robot can replace this worker's yearly baked-in salary of whatever it is, and it costs cheaper than that, you could say, well, it's we can just replace this worker with this robot. But of course, that requires a lot of capital expenditure in order to do that. So we'd expect to see, similar to we see with fleets of cars, services popping up that will allow you to take on robots as a service. So in other words, take it as a service fee, to take on humanoid robots that would be able to do certain tasks to be able to smooth out those costs. I've touched there on kind of some of the differences between Chinese and American development. I know, Kurt, you've been looking into this a little bit, and you had some insights into how those two sides are kind of shaping up in terms of their relative positions.
Yeah, I think based on the recent news, definitely worth us taking a step back to look at the geopolitical aspects of this, particularly as you say, as various companies in both superpowers are talking about ramping up to mass production, because that's when the race will really get going. So as I mentioned, and as Michael has mentioned, the two main players are the US and China, right? At least at the moment. China can be seen as getting to the game a little bit late compared to the US. So I think it was 2023 they announced that humanoids were the new frontier in technological competition, but they have been playing some decent catch up since then. I think still the US probably has the edge. People like to say that the US dominates the brain of the humanoid. So that's stuff like the artificial intelligence, that's stuff like the most advanced chips. Whereas China can be said to dominate the body of the humanoid, which is a funny way of putting it, but it's due to China's history in manufacturing, particularly in robot manufacturing. So those big chunky robots I was talking about at the top of the podcast, China's been really successful in those, and particularly manufacturing the components for those. So it's got a real good history in this kind of manufacturing, and it has a very close hardware supply chain, which the US just doesn't have, but is working on that. Away from supply, China also has a huge domestic market, and the US does, but China has a really big domestic market, so it can find demand there, it can grow demand there potentially more easily, and potentially faces a bit less of a regulatory environment, and might be more willing to provide subsidies to its main players. So all of that might factor in to say that China could may be in a position to produce these things quicker and more cheaply. So if we look at Unitree's robot, which is a Chinese company's robot, it's pricing its robot at around 13,000 USD, and that comes, complete with roundhouse kick functions for that price. Whereas Elon Musk has tentatively said that Optimus might cost between 20 and 30,000. And obviously there might be different robots with different functionality, but you can already see different price points there. So yeah, I think US ahead at the moment, but the stage looks set for China to really make a go of it. And we've seen earlier this year in the context of AI with DeepSeek, how China can really surprise. So I'd expect to see more of those surprises in the humanoid space as we move on.
Well, what a great note to end on there, Kurt. I'm glad we didn't go too much into anything to do with trade wars or tariffs, because otherwise this entire podcast would have been out of date 3 seconds after it's released. But great talking to you. Tour de force as always. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you'd like to stay up to date with the latest insights and further podcasts, please do subscribe to our TechLaw series on YouTube or wherever you get your usual podcasts from. So on that, thank you very much, and I'll see you again soon.